just going to put this mic in. As mentioned, my name is Nate Hendley, and yes, I am the author of tonight's book, Atrocity on the Atlantic. Is this loud enough at the back? Atrocity.
Raise the mic.
Oh, raise it up.
Mic has been raised. My book, Atrocity on the Atlantic, tells the true tragic story of a Canadian hospital ship that was torpedoed by a German U-boat or submarine in the First World War. The U-boat commander tried to murder survivors, and the attack was adjudicated at the Leipzig war crime trials. These are the very little known judicial proceedings that came after the First World War. German court made an apocal ruling that's forever changed war crime prosecutions and continues to influence international law. Yet, for reasons I will discuss, the Landovery Castle tragedy has largely been forgotten. I hope my book refocuses attention on a terrible war crime and the brave men and women who were on board the Landovery Castle the night it was torpedoed. Now, I will be happy to take questions, but I would ask you wait until the end of the presentation. After we have question and answer, I will be going downstairs, and I have a nice table of books that I'm happy to sell and sign and continue chatting a bit. So to begin, Canadian hospital ship Landovery Castle was approaching the coast of Ireland on the evening of June 27, 1918, when a torpedo from German U-boat 86 exploded against its port side. The ship was traveling from Halifax to Britain to pick up ill and injured servicemen and bring them back home to Canada for a long recuperation. Because it was on a return trip, it wasn't carrying any patients when it was hit. There were, however, over 250 people on board, a British crew and 94 members of the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Captain Edward Sylvester rang the engine room to stop the engines and halt the ship's forward momentum. There was no response. The crew in the engine room were either dead or incapacitated. The 500-foot passenger liner turned hospital ship kept plowing ahead, intensifying the flood of water pouring through the gaping hole in its side. The telegraph equipment in what was called the Marconi room had also been damaged, so a distress message couldn't be sent. Nobody knew that they were in trouble. Little background. Under the Hague Conventions, and these are pre-war treaties that tried to regulate combat, most of the countries fighting in the Great War had signed them. Hospital ships are supposed to be off limits. They can be stopped, they can be searched, but they can't be attacked. In return, such vessels had to be painted white with green horizontal stripes and prominent red crosses. They had to keep their lights on at night. And very importantly, they were forbidden from carrying armaments, munitions, or armed soldiers. The names of all these hospital ships were passed on to the enemy so they could avoid them, in theory. Now, the Landovery Castle had been abiding by all of these strictures, but U-boat 86 Commander Helmut Patzig didn't care. Patzig was a skilled hunter who had sunk over a dozen vessels in his time as commander of U-boat 86 and earned the Iron Cross first and second class. Now, his own crew members later testified that they knew this was a hospital ship when they torpedoed it, but they had reasons and they thought it was a legitimate target. Germany was convinced that the Allies were abusing Hague privileges and using hospital ships to ferry munitions. Several other hospital ships had been attacked prior to the Landovery Castle ambush. In 1917, the German Imperial Navy actually authorized its U-boats to attack hospital ships. It gave them permission. Now, this permission was only allowed in the Mediterranean Sea in a, quote, maritime zone from the English Channel to the North Sea. The Landovery Castle wasn't anywhere near these kill sites, but no matter. This, by the way, is an English translation of the memo that was sent. The Landovery Castle continued moving forward as it sank, making it difficult to launch lifeboats. Compounding matters, many of the lifeboats had been damaged beyond repair by the blast. In a later journal entry, Orderly William Pilot described his experiences on the sinking ship. Quite a mess up with the lifeboats being smashed or swamped. After being in two, finally climbed aboard ship again, although decks were underwater. Then got away in a raft with 2 sailors, wrote Pilot. This is his actual diary, which I took a photograph of at the Canadian War Museum. Private William Pilot was on his 3rd round trip when the Landovery Castle was hit. He had been serving since 1914. Initially in the Canadian Corps Cyclist Battalion. After being wounded, he was transferred to the Medical Corps and then assigned to the Landovery Castle. Several other members of the medical staff were also longtime veterans who had been on several cross-Atlantic journeys before. Their ranks included Acting Sergeant Arthur Knight, shown here in his hospital bed recovering. When word came to abandon ship, Knight found himself in lifeboat number 5 with the Landovery Castle's contingent of female nurses. The Landovery Castle was transporting 14 nursing sisters, as they were called, and all of them were huddled in lifeboat number 5. Some of them in their distinctive blue and white uniforms. Others were still wearing bedclothes. There had been no time to change before rushing to the lifeboat. Lifeboat number 5 was in a perilous situation. It was still dangling from the davits. These are the pulleys that raise and lower the lifeboats from the ocean. Knight and other men in the lifeboats hacked at ropes with axes to free the lifeboat from the rapidly sinking hospital ship. Lifeboat number 5 made it to the ocean surface, and then another danger emerged. The fragile lifeboat kept banging against the side of the Landovery Castle. The occupants of the lifeboat used oars to try to maintain a distance between themselves and the rapidly sinking ship. Through all their efforts, all the oars snapped or broke. The ropes were eventually cut and lifeboat number 5 was free, but not for long. The lifeboat was caught in the suction of the sinking hospital ship. We were carried towards the stern of the ship when suddenly the poop deck seemed to break away and sink. The suction drew us quickly into the vacuum, Knight later recalled. Knight served as witness to the nurses' final moments. According to him, the nursing sisters accepted their fate with stoicism and bravery. I estimate we were in the boat about 8 minutes. In that whole time, I did not hear a complaint or a murmur from one of the sisters. There was not a cry for help or any outward evidence of fear. I only overheard one remark, Knight said later. Margaret Fraser, shown here, who was the matron or leader of the nurses, looked at Knight and asked, "Sergeant, do you think there is any hope for us?" "No," he said. The lifeboat tipped and all 14 nurses fell in the water along with Knight. Now, while this is Lake June, this is the North Atlantic, so the water would have been freezing cold. You could die of hypothermia within minutes. Knight was dragged under the surface, rose up, smacked his head on debris, then was dragged under again. A powerful explosion, probably from the ship's superheated boilers coming in contact with the frigid water, propelled him to the surface once more. He could no longer see the nurses. Presumably, they had all drowned. Knight swam. He was so out of it, he didn't even notice that the surface submarine had cruised next to him. This is not a picture of the U-boat that sank Landovery Castle, but gives you an idea of what these subs looked like. They actually spent most of their time on the surface. It was then pitch dark, and I heard an order in good but slightly accented English to come alongside of what proved to be a submarine. I scrambled on board the submarine, recalled Knight. Once he got on board, the sailors on the sub tossed him back in the freezing water, and the U-boat cruised on, approaching a lifeboat. The English-speaking crewmen ordered survivors onto the subdeck, interrogated one at a time. They stood in front of the conning tower, which is the jutting tower in the, towards the back of the sub. Major Thomas Lyon of the Medical Corps tried to leap from lifeboat to subdeck, but was grabbed by a German sailor. He landed awkwardly on the steel deck and broke his foot in the process. His captors gave him no time to recover as they barraged him with questions. "You are an American flight officer," said an English-speaking submariner. "No, we never carried anybody but patients," replied the startled major. Lyon was eventually released, and other survivors were interrogated, and everybody said the same thing. The Landovery Castle was only carrying patients, didn't have any right now, but it was going to get some, didn't have any munitions, it wasn't breaking any rules. After more futile questioning, Patsy conceded the Landovery Castle hadn't been doing anything wrong. Now this put him in the position of violating the Hague Conventions because he couldn't justify the sinking. Patsy ended the interrogations and ordered most of his men below deck. With the help of 2 lieutenants, Ludwig Dithmar and John Bolt, Patsy directed a gunner to shell the Landovery Castle lifeboats with a 10.5 centimeter deck cannon. Patsy wanted to kill all witnesses to his war crime. Now, this is a close-up of an American propaganda poster showing the shelling of the lifeboats. The action is a little exaggerated. The sub is much closer than it would have been in real life. And you'll notice the lifeboat contains some female occupants. By this point, it is believed all the female nurses were drowned. The poster also shows the sinking hospital ship in the top left corner. A single lifeboat with 6 Canadian medical personnel and 18 British crew members escaped the massacre. Their ranks included Major Lyon, Captain Sylvester, and Arthur Knight and William Pilot, both of whom had been plucked out of the water. The men in the lifeboat observed the shelling as they fled with oars and a small sail. I can recall at least 12 shots, presumably in the area where our lifeboats and the survivors were supposed to be. One shell came very close to our own boat, Lyon later stated. Captain Sylvester guided the tiny craft towards the coast of Ireland. Now the lifeboat was well provisioned. It had food and water for 50 men, but the occupants ate and drank sparingly because they had no idea how long they'd be on the open ocean for. Flashlights provided a little bit of illumination at night, but anyone who had been in the water shivered in wet clothing. After 2 days at sea, the lifeboat was rescued by a passing British destroyer. The men were taken on board, fed, clothed, and then taken to Plymouth, England. Several of them ended up in hospital being treated for exposure. U-boat 86 continued its journey home. It sank an American troop transport and then hit a sea mine, which caused a lot of damage to the sub. Some of the more superstitious crew members took this as a sign of God's wrath for sinking a hospital boat. At some point on the return voyage, Captain Patzig, pictured here, gathered his men in the control room and he ordered them to silence. "Whatever has happened, I take on my conscience before God, and I want you to say nothing about it," he told his men. Back at his base, Patzig wrote down the details of his patrol in his war diary. Now you notice he lists the names of the ships he sank in the third column from the left and their estimated tonnage. There's one name conspicuously missing from this list. There's no mention of the Landovery Castle in the war diary for his patrol. Patzig even drew a fake sea chart that's supposed to show where the U-boat traveled around the British Isles. And the distance he charted made it look like the U-boat hadn't gone anywhere near the Landovery Castle ambush site. Patzig's attempt to cover his tracks failed dismally. News of the Landovery Castle sinking, based on survivor testimony, caused global outrage. Even in the midst of a brutal war, some events still had the power to shock. The notion of a submarine pumping shells into lifeboats and 14 female nurses drowning was appalling. Hospital ship willfully sunk, read the front page of the San Francisco Examiner. Latest victim of Hun ferocity. This headline is from the Toronto Daily Star. Hun at the time was a derogatory term for German. There is something peculiarly infamous in a stealthy attack on a hospital ship. The vessel is not armed. It carried no fighting men. It is helpless. The inhuman monster who commanded the submarine knew exactly what he was doing, editorialized the Philadelphia Inquirer. Germany's awful debt to the world continues to grow, read a statement from the British Admiralty. Another hospital ship has been torpedoed. It is to be noted that in this, as in all other instances, the German submarine had a perfect right to stop and search the ship under the Hague Convention. She preferred, however, to torpedo the Landovery Castle. This slide shows a selection of front-page headlines from around the world. We've got Great Britain, Canada, United States. This was a major story in its day. The attack on the Landovery Castle marked the death of 234 medical personnel and crew, and the end of a line for a ship that was created to transport tourists, not war-wounded soldiers. The Landovery Castle was built in the vast shipyards of Glasgow, Scotland. Designed as a passenger liner, it was registered in December 1913 as part of the Union Castle fleet. Now, in case you're wondering, Sir Owen Phillips, who was the chairman of Union Castle, was from Wales. So all the ships that the company built were named after Welsh castles in his honor, which is how the Landovery Castle got its very distinctive moniker. The Landovery Castle was 500 feet long and had a single funnel. It wasn't in the same league as superstar liners like the Britannic, Olympic, and ill-fated Titanic, all of them owned by the White Star Line. Photos of the Landovery Castle after it launched, however, reveal a luxurious ship in its own right. It had a large, airy first-class promenade deck, well-furnished first-class smoking room, and decent amenities for second and third-class passengers. Now just remember the era. This is a time when air travel is practically non-existent. If you wanted to journey thousands of miles on land, you took a train. If you wanted to journey thousands of miles on sea, you took a ship. As such, the Landovery Castle began doing round trips from Britain to South Africa via the Suez Canal. This slide shows a pretty typical ad depicting a lengthy cruise. The Landovery Castle is mentioned in the fourth sentence from the bottom. And it would take people, on a leisurely route, and this was a big deal. It also carried mail, because at the time it was the fastest way to deliver mail long distances. You put it in a ship. The Landovery Castle might have remained a passenger liner, but for the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914. Fighting on the Western Front soon devolved into a brutal slog. Rapid-fire rifles, machine guns, long-range artillery, barbed wire, and mud resulted in enormous casualties on all sides. The British Army incurred nearly 20,000 fatalities on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Now, to put that in perspective, that is a 24-hour loss of men, greater than the worst year of the Vietnam War for the American Army. British authorities needed more ships to transport reinforcements and wounded patients. Their existing fleet simply wasn't big enough. So the British government began to exercise its prerogative to seize passenger ships and press them into military service. Several ships from the Union Castle line, including the Landovery Castle, became the property of the government. At first, the Landovery Castle was used as a troop transport, then it was transformed into a hospital ship. And this was a pretty elaborate procedure where crews knocked out walls, they installed cots, they put in beds and medical facilities. Hospital ships were more than just transports for wounded men. They contained pretty much all the same facilities you'd see in a land-based hospital, be it rooms for x-rays, surgery, examination, etc. Landovery Castle was initially a British hospital ship. It also made 2 voyages across the Atlantic, bringing ill and injured Canadians back to Canada. These trips were made at the behest of the Canadian government. In March 1918, the Landovery Castle was transferred to Canadian authority, and it became one of 5 hospital ships used to bring servicemen home. Now, a word about these patients. The policy in the Canadian Army at the time, as with all militaries then, was to patch up wounded men, put them back into action as soon as possible. To be put on a hospital ship and sent home basically meant you were so badly injured the Army had no further use for you. Sadly, there was no shortage of badly wounded patients. By 1918, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the name given to soldiers from Canada fighting in Europe, had established a reputation for bravery and daring, but this came at a very steep cost. The Canadian battle at Vimy Ridge in 1917 resulted in 3,600 dead. This photo shows Canadian soldiers on the way to the front. The battle at Passchendaele that same year led to another 4,000 killed Canadians. And these are just fatalities. These victories also left behind countless injured. On its last voyage to Canada in June 1918, the Landovery Castle transported 644 patients. Over half of these patients had lost a limb. 27 were listed as stretcher cases, meaning they were so badly wounded they couldn't move. 14 patients had tuberculosis, and 37 were psychiatric casualties, minds and nerves ground down by the endless slaughter. This memo doesn't show the psychiatric casualties, that is on a different memo. The ship docked June 17th in Halifax. Before anyone is allowed out, an official named Dr. Harold Kerr comes on board to inspect the paperwork, the patients, the staff, every nook and cranny on the ship. It's his job to make sure the ship is following Hague Convention rules. Some patients then were allowed off. Some of them required assistance coming down the gangplank. Once they came ashore, these patients became the responsibility of a civilian agency called the Military Hospital Commission. While the ship was in dock, people who had posted letters they had written during the voyage, people posted letters they had written during the voyage. One such letter was written by nursing sister Gladys Irene Sayre to her sister, who she addressed as "My Dear Win." In the letter, Nurse Sayre mused about family, the war, and linen. "Instead of registering your table linen, I bought it. A good idea, eh? Mother will tell you I only had a few hours' notice on leave on transport duty, and here I am, not far from Halifax," wrote Sayre. "I suppose Mother will be worried, but I do wish she wouldn't. I did not solicit the job or try for it in any way. In fact, do not want it, but they sent me, so here I am. Since things have been so rotten in France, I am glad, because I hate to appear a quitter by sitting high and safe in England, and Atlantic travel is active duty of the most active kind," added Nurse Sayre. Nurse Sayre was born in Bath, England, 1889. Her family moved to Canada when she was an infant. She grew up in Montreal. Sayre studied nursing at Montreal General Hospital and signed up for medical duties with the military in 1916. In an era where women were expected to be cloistered and clueless, Army nurses were exposed to violence, hardship, and gore. They helped with bloody surgery, administered medicines, applied and changed dressings, calmed the wounded, and consoled the dying. They also had to tidy wards, make beds, stock medical supplies, clean blood and mud off injured men, and provide them with cigarettes, hot drinks, and food. Nursing sisters had to stay unmarried and adhere to a strict code of behavior. Being around patients, they were frequently exposed to the common diseases of the era. Serving in England, Nurse Sayre came down with diphtheria, a potentially fatal illness at the time. She recovered, then was assigned to the Landovery Castle. In return for their devotion and duty, nursing sisters enjoyed a privileged status. They had the equivalent military rank of Army lieutenant and the right to vote. The Wartime Elections Act of 1917 gave the franchise to all women serving in the armed forces. The right to vote in federal elections wouldn't be extended to all Canadian women until 1918. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas MacDonald, pictured here, was in charge of all the Canadian medical personnel on the Landovery Castle. He was appointed to the Landovery Castle shortly after Canada chartered the ship, and underneath MacDonald was this entire hierarchy of surgeons, doctors, orderlies, and nurses. The officers included Thomas Lyon. Born in Scotland, Lyon obtained his medical education there before moving to Canada. He joined the Canadian Army Medical Corps in 1915. During one of his posts, he was placed in Salonika, Greece. And this was a very tough posting, featuring brackish water, intense heat, swarms of insects, and rampant disease. Like many colleagues, Lyon became ill. First he had dysentery, then pneumonia. This is a card from his medical file. In May 1917, an ailing Lyon was sent to the island of Malta on a hospital ship called the Dover Castle. The Dover Castle dropped Lyon off, boarded patients, and then was torpedoed by a U-boat off the coast of Algeria. Safe in Malta, Lyon slowly recovered and was transported to England without further incident. He joined the Landovery Castle in March 1918. As a hospital ship, the Landovery Castle served its purpose well. An inspection report said the ship's X-ray department was well equipped and its equipment was in excellent condition. But what was life like on board for patients? Now, for some insights, we have the musings of James Wilfred Hearn, who edited a patient newsletter published while the ship was ocean-bound. Hailing from Nova Scotia, Hearn joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1914, served in the artillery, was wounded, and the wound was serious enough to take him permanently out of the war. The doctor examining him determined a large foreign body lay against his aorta. The doctor recommended that Hearn be, quote, invalided to Canada, which is how he ended up on the Landovery Castle. Now, excerpts of the patient newsletter, which were later published in Ottawa, seem to indicate that Hearn and his friends were pretty pleased with their accommodations. I would like, through the medium of publicity, to voice on behalf of the patients on board our heartfelt and most sincere appreciation of the kindness shown to us by the officer commanding troops, medical officers, matron, nursing sisters, and personnel without a single exception. A naturally tiresome journey has been made very pleasant indeed through the efforts and staff and crew of His Majesty's hospital ship Landovery Castle. While Hearn doesn't say so, he might have taken in a concert during the nearly week-long voyage by orderly William Jackson. Jackson, who joined the Medical Corps in 1914, came from a musical family. His father started the first orchestra in the city of Saskatoon. William picked up the clarinet, and he excelled at it. He won talent competitions for his skill. After several postings, he was told to report to the Landovery Castle. Evidently, he didn't bother mentioning this to his parents because the Saskatoon Daily Star ran the following article. Mr. and Mrs. John Jackson have received word of their son, William Jackson, who is now in active service. Mr. P.H. Munro says Mr. Jackson is now serving on a ship and he attended 2 concerts at which he played. Now the ship in question, obviously, was the Landovery Castle. After a couple days in port, the crew and medical personnel returned to prepare for another voyage to Britain. The ship was inspected a second time by Dr. Kerr before it was allowed to leave Halifax June 20th. The journey was pleasant at first. The ocean was calm and the ship didn't run into any storms. Ideal summer weather prevailed. All went well and uneventfully until Thursday evening, June 27th. Read a subsequent government report. In the days after the sinking became public knowledge, politicians tried to outdo each other with heated rhetoric. and a July 4th event in London, 2 future prime ministers issued blood-curdling warnings. The war has become a conflict of Christian civilization with scientific barbarism. One system or the other must decisively prevail. Germany must be beaten, must know, must feel she is beaten. Her defeat must be expressed in terms of facts that will deter others from emulating her crimes, stated Winston Churchill, then UK Minister of Munitions. Up next, Arthur Meighen said he agreed with Churchill and said, "It is better that the world should perish than that those murderers should live." For his part, Sir Robert Borden, whose comment is on the screen here, decried the sinking of our hospital ships and murder of our nurses and doctors. In a grim irony, given its role as a healing ship, "Remember the Landovery Castle" became the battle cry of Canadian soldiers at the Battle of Amiens in August 1918. This campaign helped lead to an armistice in November, followed by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Now the treaty, which officially ended the war, called for war crime trials of prominent German figures. Now there was a problem. The Hague Convention didn't really offer much of a guide as to how to actually hold a war crimes trial. There was no international criminal court, and kind of the whole idea of holding leaders responsible for wartime action was kind of novel. Nonetheless, the Allies insisted on having war crime trials. Now, remember, Germany at the time is beset with terrorism on the left and the right. The government is very shaky, and they are very leery about handing over civilians to be put on trial before Allied military tribunals. So Berlin suggests a compromise. We'll hold war crime trials in Leipzig before the German Supreme Court. The Allies can provide lists of suspects, witnesses, and evidence, while Germany handled both the prosecution and the defense. An agreement was reached, and the Leipzig war crime trials began in early 1921. I get asked all the time, why did the Allies agree to such sort of watered-down proceedings? And the answer is simple. The First World War ended in a bit of a mess. The Allies didn't actually occupy Germany. The war ended with an armistice. The German soldiers marched home with their rifles on their arms. So if the Allies wanted to get the Germans to do anything, they had to actually get them to cooperate. So they were playing with a very weak hand. Initially, the Allies provided the names of hundreds of suspects, and this kept getting whittled down until only a few dozen people remained. In case you're wondering, the United States, which had entered the First World War with such great gusto, didn't want anything to do with the trial. They took little interest and didn't participate. In the end, less than 20 cases were heard in Leipzig, one of which involved the Landovery Castle. Now, the Allies wanted to put Commander Patzig on trial, but they couldn't track him down. After the war, Patzig absconded to his home city of Danzig, which was now a, quote, free city administered by the League of Nations. And this is all again part of this complicated post-war order. And basically what this means is the Allies can't go to Danzig, and the Germans can't march in either to arrest this guy. So he's kind of, hiding out. Germany, however, is under a lot of pressure to show results, so they hurriedly arrest the 2 lieutenants who helped the commander. Remember, 2 guys, John Bolt, Ludwig Dittmar, helped with the shelling of the lifeboats. They build a case around them, and when their trial opens, July 12, 1921, the lieutenants are unrepentant. "I obeyed my commander, his orders were law, I am not guilty," testified Bolt, his words translated into English. This slide shows a picture of the inside of the Leipzig war crime trials. The justices sat around a horseshoe-shaped table, and witnesses would talk in front of them. They would stand up to give their testimony. Testimony would be translated into English or German, depending who was speaking. And what the photo doesn't show is this room would also be packed with reporters from around the world, because again, this was a huge story at the time. even if we've forgotten it today, and also German spectators who were very vocal in supporting the defendants. They felt that this whole process was extremely unfair. Crew members in the U-boat testified they knew the Landovery Castle was a hospital ship, but they trotted out the convenient lie that such ships carried armed soldiers and munitions. Landovery Castle survivors were among the witnesses for the prosecution. Captain Sylvester had died of heart failure a year earlier, but Major Lyon was available. Now, problem. Bolton Dithmar's trial had been arranged so hastily that Major Lyons only has a few days to get from his hometown, and he lives in Vancouver, BC. He has to get 7,000 miles by ship, train, and other means from Vancouver to Leipzig. Lyon, shown here, recovering in his hospital bed, furnished the sensation of the trial by immediately abusing the infamous and cowardly methods used by the submarine commander. He vehemently attacked Captain Patzig for the sinking of the helpless ship, wrote the Vancouver Sun. Lyon testified that the Landovery Castle was following all Hague rules and wasn't doing anything wrong. His testimony clearly hit a nerve. He speaks without a trace of emotion, he finishes his evidence, and there is deep silence throughout the courtroom, reported The Guardian. State prosecutor Dr. Ludwig Ebermeyer also tore into the commander of U-Boat 86. Where is Captain Patzig? Why did the brave man not appear? Why is he leaving the blame for the sinking of hospital ship Landovery Castle on his subordinates? Why does not Captain Patzig come out of his hiding place and say, I sunk the Landovery Castle because I was told she carried American pilots, sneered the prosecutor. In its deliberations, the German Supreme Court pretty much ignored the legality of torpedoing the Landovery Castle. They focused entirely on what happened after the torpedo sank the ship. In other words, the shelling of the lifeboats. On July 16, 1921, everyone expected Germany to be acquitted. That didn't happen. The justices found Bolt and Dithmar guilty for their role in the attempted murder of survivors. In its ruling, the court said two epochal precedents. War crimes should be judged by international standards, and following orders is not a defense for committing illegal acts in wartime. The firing on the boats was an offense against the law of nations. In war on land, the killing of unarmed enemies is not allowed. Similarly, in war at sea, the killing of shipwrecked people who have taken refuge in lifeboats is forbidden, said the justices. While Patzig directed the shelling, his order does not free the accused from guilt. A subordinate obeying an order is liable to punishment if it was known to him that the order of the superior involved the infringement of civil or military law. It was perfectly clear to the accused that killing defenseless people in lifeboats could be nothing else but a breach of the law, added the court. Bolt and Dithmar were each sentenced to 4 years apiece in jail. The Allies thought this was ridiculously lenient, the Germans thought this was ridiculously harsh. It didn't really matter because both men escaped quickly from jail with the help of supporters. Due in part to this dismal outcome, the Leipzig trials were largely regarded by the Allies as a fiasco and a failure. Now keep in mind the times. By the 1920s, the Canadian public is ready to move on. Nearly 66,000 soldiers from Canada and Newfoundland had died in the Great War, almost all of them young men or mere boys. Countless others had been horribly injured. Remembrance became somewhat ritualistic, with a focus on a handful of clear-cut victories like Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. By contrast, there seemed little glory or gain from the Landovery Castle sinking. Tragedy overlooked plays another reason why the Landovery Castle was forgotten. The human psyche can only process so much horror. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, very well remembered. The almost equally devastating firebombing of Tokyo by conventional planes is not remembered. In Canada, the bloody Battle of Dieppe is the subject of countless books, films, documentaries, movies, etc. The slaughter of Canadian troops in Hong Kong has largely been overlooked. In a similar fashion, the Halifax explosion, which led to an outpouring of assistance, became the wartime tragedy commemorated by Canadians, not the Landovery Castle. This is not to denigrate the Halifax explosion or the people who suffered there at all. It's merely to point out that this is the wartime disaster people remember, not Landovery Castle. Timing and cynicism also contributed to the growing cultural amnesia. The Landovery Castle was sunk quite late in the war, so the Allies only had a few months to use it for propaganda purposes. By contrast, British liner the Lusitania, carrying some American passengers, was torpedoed by a U-boat in May 1915, and this gave the Allies years to portray the attack as the epitome of German barbarity. After the war ended, the public came to realize the Allies too had engaged in some acts of pretty dubious morality. The British Royal Navy had blockaded German ports during the war, causing mass starvation. The Lusitania, despite furious denials at the time, was carrying war supplies. The controversial 1930 anti-war novel Generals Die in Bed implied the Landovery Castle wasn't playing by the rules either. This book, by the way, can be roughly compared to the Canadian equivalent of All Quiet on the Western Front, though to be blunt, it's not nearly as well written, but it's very graphic, and like All Quiet, it has a very strong anti-militaristic message. In the novel, an officer graphically recounts the Landovery Castle sinking to goad Canadian soldiers to greater bloodlust. At the book's end, the narrator discovers the Landovery Castle was transporting war munitions, a blatant treaty violation. There is no evidence, however, that this is true. I remind you, this is a novel, not a piece of history. An attempt to smuggle souvenir swords on the Landovery Castle caused a huge administrative uproar. I've seen the memos that went up and down the chain of command after some guy tried to bring a couple swords on board. The ship was inspected twice before it left Halifax, and no reports indicated anything was amiss. If memories of the Landovery Castle began to fade among the public, prosecutors began taking very careful note of the Leipzig verdict because they recognized the precedent set by the German Supreme Court could be used against Nazi-era defendants. The Leipzig verdict was cited at the Kharkov trial, and this is the very first war crimes trial of World War II with Nazi defendants. It took place in late 1943 in what is now Kharkiv, Ukraine, and it pitted 3 German defendants and a collaborator against a Soviet military tribunal. Charged with massacring civilians and prisoners, the accused fell back on 2 defenses. They were just following orders, and international standards didn't apply in Hitler's Germany. In rebuttal, State Prosecutor Colonel Dunayev referenced, quote, the atrocious sinking of the British hospital ship Landovery Castle, and subsequent trial. Bolt and Ithmar had also been following orders, but the Leipzig court made clear that did not absolve them of responsibility. The actions of the defendants were, quote, major crimes and flagrant violations of international law. While Dunayev misidentified the Landovery Castle as a British ship, his point stood and all 4 men were convicted and hanged. At the end of World War II, an international military tribunal was established to try the top Nazi leadership. One of the pieces of the Constitution to this tribunal specifically disavowed the superior order's defense, except as mitigation in sentencing. In the fall of 1945, A British military tribunal in Hamburg pondered a case with strange echoes of the Landovery Castle massacre. The defendants were the crew and commander of U-boat 852, charged with trying to murder survivors of the Palouse, a transport ship torpedoed by the sub. The crew insisted they were acting under orders, but the tribunal rejected that defense. The duty to obey is limited to the observance of orders which are lawful. There can be no duty to obey that which is not a lawful order, stated Judge Advocate Melford Stevenson. As you can see in this judicial summary, Landovery Castle is cited second to bottom sentence. SS Death Squad members charged with mass murder also cited obedience to orders as a defense at the 1947 Einsatzgruppen trial in Nuremberg. And this trial was hosted by an American military tribunal. During the trial, SS Colonel Walter Blum dismissed notions of criminal culpability and international law. He defended his murderous actions on the grounds that he was following a direct command from Hitler. I've already stated that for me, the directive was the Führer order. That was my war law. This defense was slapped down by U.S. Brigadier General Telford Taylor, chief counsel for the tribunal. Soldiers do not have to obey, quote, palpably criminal orders, a principle that had been concisely set forth in the decision of the Supreme Court at Leipzig in the Landovery Castle case, stated Taylor. Lieutenants Dithmar and Bolt were well aware that one is not legally authorized to kill defenseless people, continued Taylor. In its decision, the U.S. military tribunal agreed, and it convicted all the SS men, sentencing them to death or prison. In 1949, 4 Geneva Conventions were released that updated and consolidated previous treaties governing wartime conduct. Attacks on hospital ships were forbidden once again. In the years following the Great War, Landovery Castle survivors and deceased were remembered in various ways. A plaque was erected in a Toronto church to nursing sister Mary Agnes Mackenzie. And this plaque caught the eye of a composer named Stephanie Martin, and she was inspired by the story behind it to write an opera about the Landovery Castle sinking. The opera premiered on the 100th anniversary of the sinking in Toronto and was later staged at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo. This photograph is from the dress rehearsal. It was a wondrous performance. I am extremely pleased to announce that WLU Opera will be restaging the Landovery Castle Opera in February of 2026. I'm looking forward to attending. This slide shows a photograph I took of the Halifax Memorial, and this was built to commemorate the 3,267 sailors and soldiers who died at sea during both World Wars from Canada and Newfoundland. It's a beautiful, poignant marker looking out onto the water. One of the plaques on its side contains the names of the medical staff and nurses who perished on the Landovery Castle. Clarinet player William Jackson is likewise remembered on a plaque erected in Saskatoon in the early 1920s. As you can see, it says perished Landovery Castle, age 29, honored by mother. Thomas Lyon, for his part, opened a medical practice in Victoria, BC. He retired before the Second World War and moved to Great Britain. He died in 1948 in Deal, Kent, without having married. Arthur Knight moved to London, Ontario after the war. He later married, had children, and moved to British Columbia. His grandson, Dave Sales, who I have the honor of interviewing, recalls Sergeant Knight as a kind, quiet-spoken man. Dave knew his father had served in the Great War, but was unfamiliar with the specifics of his actions. He didn't talk a lot. He never talked about his experiences in the war. It was never brought up when I was a child, states Sales today. Sales is convinced his grandfather suffered from wartime trauma for decades. I think at the end of his life he had some form of what I think was dementia. I'm only guessing. I was 11. No one said it was dementia, but he was in hospital and the man in the bed next to him spoke German, and he was having a lot of flashbacks to when he was in the military, recalls Sales. Arthur Knight died December 1st, 1966 at age 80. U-boat 86 Commander Helmut Patzig flourished after the Great War. He was never prosecuted for his crime, and he rejoined the German Navy in World War II, primarily serving as a trainer. He died in 1984. The precedents established at Leipzig continue to have a powerful influence. These principles help shape the legal foundations of the International Criminal Court, established in 2002 to prosecute war criminals around the world. The court rejects the superior order's defense and views war crimes as violations of internationally accepted norms and law. It might have been some solace to the brave men and women on the Landovery Castle that their fate would lead to the universal legal axiom that people who commit war crimes should be held responsible for their actions. My book, Atrocity on the Atlantic, is available at Chapters and Barnes & Noble, Amazon, other retailers. As mentioned, it will be available here today for sale and signing. I have an app on my phone that can take credit cards. My website, natehendley.ca, offers more details about my other books and background. But before we go downstairs, I would like to throw the floor open. If there's any questions, comments, statements from anybody here, I'm happy to answer anything or just listen if somebody has something to say. Sir?
Roughly where in the Atlantic was the torpedo?
Sure. Excuse me. The question, I'll repeat the questions just for the sake of everyone. The question was, where in the Atlantic was the torpedoing? It was off the coast of Ireland. I would have to check my own book, but about 114 miles from the nearest sort of land point in Ireland. So close, but still, you know, as if you're in a lifeboat, it's still in the middle of nowhere. They've never recovered the wreck. They know roughly where it is, but as far as I'm aware, it's still down there. They haven't dived down and taken photos of it or anything.
So would that be approximately same general area as the Lusitania?
Roughly, like again, you know, if I were a sailor, I'd probably say, no, you're totally wrong. It would be, but for a general layman, yes. The Lusitania was approaching Ireland when it was torpedoed. It was actually closer to Ireland. People on the deck could see the Irish coast when it was torpedoed. So both ships were sunk near Ireland, which is sort of one of those odd coincidences. But as I note, you know, Lusitania went on to become this incredible rallying point, and the Landovery Castle was very quickly forgotten. Any other comments, questions, concerns? Ma'am, go ahead.
Yes, I'm sure you covered it already. What time of day did you say that the attack took place?
Sorry. The question was, what time of day did the attack take place? Roughly 9 o'clock at night ship time. And I should repeat, my presentation has to telescope a lot of information into a short period. So I do sometimes have to leave out, you know, certain details, but the book explains how, like, the lighting went off on the ship, the emergency dynamo kicked in. So to compound the horror of being torpedoed and the ship sinking, you had all the lights go out, and you had to sort of work with just the emergency lights. So roughly 9 o'clock ship time,
And
PM, I should say.
That's why one of the boats was able to get away and not get shelled.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's a very good point. The one lifeboat got away, because keep in mind, I mean, the ocean would be pitch black. The U-boat would have lights on the conning tower, but that's not very helpful in miles and miles of open water. So the one lifeboat basically was able to escape under the cover of darkness. So that's a very good point. If it was the middle of the day, then I think they might have all died. Sir?
Could they not have gone after the captain after the Second World War?
And pardon me?
Could they not have gone after the captain after the Second World War?
Question is, could they not have gone after the captain in the Second World War? The answer is yes. I think that there probably just simply was no appetite for it, that they were really focused on dealing with Nazi war criminals right after World War II. And I think the attitude might have been, well, if we had enough time, we'd deal with this, but we really want to focus. It was a mammoth task, putting all these different Nazi leaders and military people on trial. So I think it was just simply a lack of resources and a lack of will, that I think by that point, people regarded the First World War as ancient history. Sir?
So were the only survivors in that one lifeboat?
Correct. There are 24 survivors. There were over 250 people on board when the ship was hit. 94 of them were Canadian medical staff. The rest were British crew, because this was a British ship. The Canadian government just chartered it. So of that, almost all of them died. So there's only survivors for 24 guys, of whom 6 were Canadian. So it's a real horror story, well, for everybody, obviously. But the Canadian Medical Corps was just devastated. Unless I'm badly mistaken, it was the worst loss of life for Canadian medical personnel in the entire war.
The one Canadian that was in the ship with the or in the lifeboat with the nurses, and he was thrown into the water, did he get picked up by that other lifeboat then?
Yeah. He was picked up by, like the one lifeboat that got away was the captain of the ship was in that lifeboat, and they picked up a few people out of the water. William Pilot, the orderly who wrote about his experiences, Arthur Knight. So they plucked a few people out of the water, and then sort of just got away as fast as possible. Sir?
Just 2 questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Firstly, what brought this subject to your attention to the point that you had enough material or wanted to go deep enough to write a novel about it? And secondly, if you could comment, would be, we hear a lot about, or at least I do, recruitment or voluntary efforts for infantrymen, people like that, but it never dawned on me to think about what recruitment might have been like for doctors and nurses. And anything interesting about that process, or
Sure.
what happened with their roles on the home front when they left?
Sure. So 2-part question. First part was how I got interested in the story. The answer is super roundabout way. I read a lot. I read a lot of history, a lot of military history. I read books, by Pierre Burton and a few other authors about the First World War. And I'd never heard of the Landover Castle. I only heard about it about 4 or 5 years ago. I used to write articles for the website of TVO Ontario, and most of the stuff I wrote was sort of interesting crime-related stuff, because that's kind of where my books are sort of fall into that category, true crime. So I was literally just poking around on the internet, sort of interesting trials, Canada, blah, 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 and I get a hit, and it says Leipzig War Crime Trials. And first of all, I'm a little surprised. Okay, I've never heard of war crime trials after the First World War. Everyone knows about the Nuremberg trials, but the First World War? So I start reading it, and then it said the main case involved Canadian hospital ship Landover Castle. And I'm like, what? I'd never heard of this. And at first I thought it might make an interesting magazine article. But the more I read, the more I realized that this story just went on and on and on, because not only is it a tragedy of, these crew and medical staff dying at sea, but then there's this court case, and then the court case establishes these incredibly important legal precedents that basically guided the Nuremberg trials and every war crime trial since, and then somehow it was all forgotten. So there are all these different elements that I thought added up to a full book. So that's where that came from. The second question was about the recruitment of doctors and nurses. All the doctors and nurses on the ship would have actually been technically part of the Army. So they were, you know, even though they didn't obviously carry guns, they were considered part of the military. And as I mentioned, the nursing sisters had the military rank of lieutenant. You actually called them lieutenant, you know, nursing sister, blah, blah, blah. I'm not an expert on the home front in Canada in World War I, but needless to say, all these doctors and nurses leaving to serve caused massive problems at home. But I think the attitude was kind of like, well, suck it up, our soldiers are fighting, they need the best doctors and nurses, so we'll just make do with what we have. I'm not really, you know, well read enough to sort of give you an exact, you know, rundown of what happened in Canada after all these people left, but probably the same situation as what happened when all these young men left farms to go fight. And young men left, you know, various jobs that required a lot of muscle to go off and fight. And it did cause, yeah, massive, the war caused enormous disruptions, obviously in Europe, but at home too. And women did step into a lot of these roles. Any other questions, comments? Ma'am, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I find it so interesting how, like, something so important to World War II and things that have happened since in terms of war crimes, that something just, it just depends on, like, something that gets highlighted or not highlighted, or, you know, you just found something, you know, you sort of went down the rabbit hole and found all this interesting stuff that people didn't seem to have paid attention to, but was so critical.
Yeah, it was one of the experiences I had. No one, as far as I'm aware, has written a book covering all aspects of the Landover Castle sinking. There's been books about the Leipzig trials, mostly academic. There's been books about the nurses who served on the ship, which is fine, but the nurses were only one component of a larger medical staff. But no one had put all the pieces together, and I couldn't believe it. And I hate to say it was a lucky break, because, I mean, that sounds callous, but it really was an opportunity to tell this story and try to tell it from start to finish, all the aspects of it. And that's sort of what I aim to do. One of the great things is I got a chance to speak to some descendants of people who were on the ship. And that, to me, was a real privilege and a real honor. And I really hope I, you know, got their voices to sort of come out and people listen to what they say. We have time for
Can I just
one
say
more?
one more?
One more, go
Someone
ahead,
else?
Karen. Yeah,
One
Okay.
more?
I just, the story about that guy, the way, all the things that he went through to get rescued at the end, it just sounded like some Wile E. Coyote, like, cartoon. You know, like, you couldn't believe, like, all the terrible things that happened before you finally got saved.
This story is one of those, you know, it's a cliche, but it's also true. That some stories are so strange that they have to be true. Like, you couldn't possibly think of make this like a Netflix movie. You'd say, oh, come on, no way, that's ridiculous. But in this case, I constantly kept running across stuff like that. And that's, as an author, that's another thing that attracted me to this story. And I just want to thank you very much for listening and having me. And also thank our hosts, Andrea and Mark, treated me very well.